right, everyone, I'd like to show you the process of how to get your painting started. First of all, when you have your reference picture, I am not going to work with a reference picture because I want to touch on the things that I think you might be including in your painting. So the very first thing that you might be adding in is maybe the bottom edge of where some water comes together to meet the land. Okay? You might have a little bit of a tree line coming in. Notice how I'm just sketching in something subtle, and the rest of this might actually be my waterfall over here coming in, and a lot of this is not going to make sense just because I have a rock. I'm making this up to accommodate things you may want to do. And I'm going to have a waterway happening here with a little waterfall coming off of a rock, and we'll have a nice little sunset going on. I'm going to keep it pretty simple. I'm even going to put in some clouds just to show you how to make these different things. So here we go. The very first thing you're going to want to paint once you've done your basic layout, I'm not putting in every detail. First thing you want to paint is going to be your sky. That is what's most in the background. You don't want to put your sky on top of your trees or paint your trees and then your sky, because it looks like the sky is on top of the trees. So I'm going to start with my sky, and as I said, I want to do a sunset just to show you how the blending process works. So when I come in and create that, I'm going to start with my brightest part of where the sun might be. I'm going to start with white that has hardly any yellow mixed into it. Notice the amounts of paint that I have on here. I only have the colors that I need, and about the size of a quarter, maybe a little bit larger. Especially if you're doing your sky, you'll need enough paint to cover your entire paper. So as I'm going here, I'm going to start with where my bright spot is. Now, if I've got that reflective quality going, notice I'm not painting in a circle, unless, of course, my reference picture shows me a complete circle. I'm starting with my bright spot, and I'm actually going to reflect it down into my water. So I'm going to paint my water at the same time that I paint my sky. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to add a little more yellow without the white, bringing that in. And while the white area, or the lighter yellow, is wet, I want to blend that in to what is wet, letting some areas pull through. So that's why I want to go bigger than what I want, so that I can allow for that overlap and that brightness to happen there. Now, if my water had some waves in it, of course, it wouldn't be reflecting quite so evenly. I'll show you that in a minute. Next, I'm going to move into a little bit of red into my yellows. Notice I'm not going to mix it with anything. I'm going to let it mix right on the canvas. I'm barely touching the brush to the canvas. I want to pull that down into the yellow, and I'm just lightly touching it. This blending thing will take a while to get. It might even take a few layers of paint. But remember, my favorite part of acrylic painting is the fact you can paint over what you think might be a mistake. And I'm going to keep going with that a little bit into the water here. But I am going to leave some white areas. And come back in with the yellows. I'm just going to extend this down. And you'll see why in a little bit. So we'll go in there. Now from here with the reds, I want to start pulling in the blues. So I am going to wash my brush. Always have a paper towel or something here so that you can get the extra water out of your brush. And now I'm going to pull the blues into the reds. And I'm maybe going to mix a little white into it. And I'm just going to pull this in so I get some inconsistencies. I want to keep it a little different. Now you got to be careful where the red or the yellows, where they turned orange, where they overlap into the blue, because you will get some green areas. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to pull it all the way to the edges. And pull that down into the lighter areas. Eventually I want to get it so it is enough paint on the paper. Notice how you've got the rough white spots. You don't want to have that. but I want to keep, with sky, you always paint just across. Keep getting enough paint on the paper. And this is where you get the blending to happen. Now the blending will not happen if you don't have enough paint or if your previous colors have dried. So it's very important to kind of work rather quickly for that reason, so you can get those blends to happen nicely. And I'm going to pull in a little more white. This is getting a little bright for my taste. Now it'll be a little different for you because you are actually color matching and trying to blend your colors. I'm going to try and do this quickly to get you guys painting. Pull that in. And it's okay not to have it one flat perfect blue. In fact, it's almost better not to have that flat blue or whatever color your sky may be, because that adds a little more dimension to it. Maybe there's some wispy clouds in the background. Now I'm just layering in the whites over the blues just to tone down that blue a little bit. Notice how I'm painting all the way to the edges of the paper, covering it until I've got a nice, smooth, transitioning blend. Now that might mean I have to come back in with one of my previous colors to get that to fade in nicely until it looks the way I want it to look. Now I would carry that all the way up. In fact, I'll do that here real quick. I'm going to grab a different brush. Yes, you might have to clean brushes once in a while and use more than one brush, and that's okay. Now I'm going to pull that darker blue down into the lighter blue. Usually your sky is lighter colored towards the bottom and darker towards the top. Nice long strokes to get that transition. You don't want to see your brush strokes in the sky. The sky is always going to be fairly smooth, unless of course you have some clouds going on in there. And just keep working it. I am, once again, feathering. I am not putting any pressure on my brush. Notice also how much paint is on my brush. I don't have paint all the way up into the silver part of my brush. I have paint only halfway up my brush, back and forth with my brush. Okay? For the most part, that's my sky. Now, if you were to add in some clouds, depending on what your clouds look like, if you're the thin, wispy clouds, while your sky is still wet, come in and take your flat brush, one that looks like this, and you're going to put just a little paint on the brush. You can see I just barely have it on the tip top of the brush. I'm going to tap off the extra paint, and I'm just going to wisp in a little bit of a cloud and maybe take my finger and smooth it down. Now when you think about a cloud, a lot of the times the clouds are darker on the bottom, most times, and lighter on the top. Nobody ever said you always had to do everything with a paintbrush. Now, if you've got those poofy clouds going on and you want those, I don't even use a brush. I finger paint. I put a little bit of paint on my finger. I'm going to tap off I kind of just tap off the extra paint. While the blue is still wet, I'm just going to tap in my cloud. Notice it's brighter. There's lighter, brighter to create some dimension, but notice the bottom kind of flattens out. Sometimes there's blues, sometimes 9 times out of 10, your cloud or your sky is not blue. It's more of a blue-violet. And you might pop in another little guy. Like I said, I'm making this up just to accommodate the different things you might have in your painting. But you kind of create some dimension that way. Okay, so that's how we do clouds. Now if we were to make these trees that are happening here, actually before we go to the trees, let's go to the water. Let's work on that one. So if I come in with my water, and now I'm going to bring in the blues, it's reflecting the sky, so I'm going to use the same colors I used up in my sky. And I'm just going to brush this in. Now notice I'm going up into my trees a little bit, but that's okay. I want these lines to show. So when I'm working, I might work back and forth between white and blue, kind of putting my lines in between the yellows that I created earlier so that that comes through in my reflective quality and make this look like water. Coming back and forth with my blue and whites or whatever color it is you see in yours. A lot of the times your shoreline is going to be darker. So maybe I'm going to come in with a darker blue or maybe even some browns, depending on what's going on in your shoreline. Or even further back, a lot of times the water is darker and builds to lighter as you get closer to the front. So I'm just going to pop in some shoreline edge here with the darker blue. As I'm going. Okay. And then I'll come back to my lighter blue as I'm working down in the front. And the water's calming down, so maybe I'll pull in some whites and create this blend, just kind of softening everything up a little bit. Working back and forth. You'll notice I don't do a lot of washing of my brush when I've got my own paint palette. So if you were lucky enough to bring in your own, that's amazing. And we just kind of work that in until we get that filled in. Now I can come in and make my trees. Now I talked about we're not going to be like a photograph. We are a painting. So we want to get this and get the basics. Now maybe you see some of the tree trunks and then maybe the trees are just in the distance and you don't have to make those details. So if you're making like a pine tree, you might start with a little bit of a brown trunk. Remember to make brown, start with a little bit of orange. So if I go with the red and I pull in a little yellow and orange complemented by blue will give me a nice little chocolatey brown. And I'm going to slowly pull my blue in until I get the brown that I want. And when you're dealing with trees, you can have a variety of browns. So make sure you use your color grids to get the brown that you need. And I'm just going to tap in a little bit of a tree trunk here. And my tree doesn't have to be perfectly straight. Just going to tap that in. And I might have some browns going along in my shoreline. I'm just going to tap them in. Do a couple different options just to show you some things. Okay, now notice I've got that white background. I have to fill that all in with green trees. But I don't want it to be a flat looking tree. I want to have a different variety. So I'm going to actually bring in a fall looking tree. Actually, let me do the pine tree first. So I'm going to come in with a blue and a little yellow. And I'm not going to pre-mix it. I'm going to put a little yellow on my brush and a little blue on my brush. I'm kind of tap it in half and half. Not going to pre-mix. I'm going to do a little triangle or a little line. So if I've got skinny trees in the background, I could just do something like this. Just tap in some lines. Notice overlapping. If I've got a bigger tree, I'm going to just zigzag it in. I don't want it to be perfect, so some sides are longer, some are bigger spaces, but I can just tap that through and create that tree. Now if I get too much blue, I come in with some yellow highlights. If I get too much yellow, like I just did there, well then I could come in with the blue on top of it. And I just keep working back and forth between my colors till I'm happy with the texture that I have created, and so forth. So there's how you can make a tree. You can see how that looks bad with the white behind, so I should have maybe done that all the way up, or I'm just going to have to bring in that many trees to compensate for leaving that white background. And to make that happen, maybe I'm just going to fill it in with light and darkness. That's a really yellow looking tree. But if I build this up and make my little forest, maybe pull in some reds, because green and red make some different darknesses and start creating a little depth in what I've got going on here to create some different types of trees. Now, if I have fall trees going on, and I just keep building that in until I can no longer see the white. Now, if I want to bring in some fall trees, instead of tapping in between with my fan brush are just for texture, I might tap back and forth between my yellows and my reds. So put yellow on my fan brush and a little red on my fan brush, okay? And then I might just tap in some of these colors to create that fall looking tree. And maybe I'm going to pull that, if my greens were dry, I could come in with that red on top. And I can build in that shoreline. Now, if my trees are reflecting into my water, I might bring those colors into my water, like so, to create those reflections. And then I might smear it with my fingers, because in the water, it gets a little reflective. Okay, so those are some basics. If you're going to make the waterfall, I'm going to add this in there if anybody is interested. I would first paint the rock or whatever it is, the feature that the water is coming off of. So I'm going to real quick make a brown. Just mix a little bit of the reds and the blues and the yellows to make my brown. I'm going to darken that up a bit. And I'm actually going to use my round brush because I don't want the sharp edges on it. So I'm going to use more of my detail brush. I'm going to bring in the brown just to paint my tree up, or my rock. Make sure you mix enough. And then I'm going to have my water coming right off of that. Now before I get done with my rock, I do have to have some light areas and some dark areas to that rock. So he's not going to be painted one perfect flat color because that would be boring. So I'm going to come in with a little white where the light might be hitting it and smear it down with my finger to add a little dimension to that rock. Okay? Or yellow or orange or whatever colors might be causing that reflective quality. Okay? Create some of those. Once I've got that, now I can come in to do the waterfall aspect of it. Okay? So I'm going to clean up my fan brush. I'm going to real quick paint in some water underneath because we've got to have the water that the waterfall is crashing into. So let's just paint that up. Now I normally wouldn't do this with a fan brush, so it's just the brush I grabbed. Now I can bring in my waterfall. So I'm going to tap in, I'm going to use the fan brush for this. I'm just going to put in a little paint on the top edge, and we're going to do what's called a dry brush. That means you get 1 or 2 swipes, that's about it. So the paint that I put on here, I'm actually going to wipe off the extra paint so that there's hardly any paint coming on. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to smear it down. Now I might come in with a little bit more just because this paint's pretty wet right now and drag it down. I don't want it to be perfect, but I want to have that. Now I'm going to come in with more white on my brush, mixed in with a little bit of the blue while the blue is wet, and I'm going to crash it. So I'm just tapping to make it look like my waterfall is crashing into my water. And there's the basics of how you create a waterfall. So I've kind of skipped around. I haven't finished the painting, but I want you to get to the point to get started on yours. So I will be around to answer any questions you may have.